everybody, it's Romania Black, and we are on episode 14 of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And last week could have been just your standard run-of-the-mill recap, but no. No. Instead, we had lots of theorizing, lots of theories that are probably going to be wrong, but it's fine. But I had some revelations come through, and we have comments to talk about, so we just need to dive in because this intro is probably going to be long, so I'm going to apologize ahead of time. But I want to start out by saying KA over on YouTube. KA has followed my channel since the beginning. They are awesome. They give me lots of voice actor information constantly in this series, and they pointed out that in episode 7, which is Jury's episode, we got her backstory, the friend that Jury's could-be lover had a crush on, the guy, his voice actor is actually the same as Usopp and L from Death Note. And I was like, oh, and not that that's surprising in the sense that, oh, Usopp and L's voice actor could be this random guy, but this came out in like the late 90s, and Death Note was like 2008, 2010, so it wasn't that much time in between, and One Piece was going around all on at the same time. But I thought that was really cool. It's just when you put time in perspective of when these series were coming out, it's like, oh, that's crazy. So that was really cool to know. Ira S, as well as Paul Funyan, pointed out that that in the original translation, the line from Kiryu Toga, instead of saying "I'm a gentleman," it says "I'm a feminist." I was like, no. I don't know. In any sense of the word, Kiryu is so wrong because I studied rhetoric and composition. I did gender studies classes in college. I was like, there are lots of different waves of feminism. The wave of feminism I kind of ascribe to is like the 80s, the equality feminism, where it's like all genders are equal. That's kind of what I'm not the bra burning feminist. I'm not like the women should control everything and men need to be in the dirt. No, that's not me. I'm very much like the all genders are equal. If you're feminist, that means you support equality amongst genders. That's my thing. In any of the senses of feminism, I'm like, Kiryu is not that, because he's not promoting equality amongst genders, and he's definitely not promoting women being over men. He's like, no, he's like, it's no. But that's just so funny. Now I know one of the memes of Kiryu being, I'm a feminist. I'm like, sure, Jan. Okay. Shao Mick Hassin pointed out that the show is juggling a lot about memory, how we interpret past events, and our connections to others in these first handful of episodes. So yeah, the very first act of the series definitely sets up that memory is going to come into play a lot with this, how we remember things, the factor of nostalgia. We really saw that in Mickey's storyline, how memory can be skewed, and how one person remembers something is not always the way the other person remembers it. So, which I thought was fascinating. Episode 4 and 5, I talked a lot about that. But I'm really excited to see how that comes into play with this series and what else we do with it. So that's really nice. Now, Oliver Jajado pointed out for episode 9, the commentary from Ikuhara. It says, plot-heavy and confusing Utena episodes typically result in more cryptic and all-over-the-place commentary. And I was like, which, knowing this as I've watched a few episodes ahead from episode 9, I'm like, okay, well, will some of this commentary tie into the current episodes we're watching? Might be, because here is the commentary for for episode 9. The castle said to hold eternity. There was a little princess, and she was very sad for her mother and father having died. That's a fragment of the myth that we tell in the prologue. So there's a myth. There's a mythological aspect of it. We talked about aliens, basically aliens last week, but it's only a little part of it, so that's important to know too. Living on, it's just making me sick, end quote. Utena saves Anthy. So that's what the story was about. But what does she save Anthy from? That's the central issue. I'm like, okay, so the idea of living on just makes me sick. It's like, if you keep going and surviving, there has to be a reason. There has to be motivation and a reason that you're doing it, right? Otherwise, you're just going to be miserable and feel like you're stuck in this space that you don't feel like you deserve to exist in or belong in. So what does Utena save Anthy from? That's the big question. Is it from the clutches of Toga and the clutches of these other people? What does that mean? These are all very good questions that the series is making us ask. But this is the part that got me. Two boys, which is Saionji and Toga, discover an unusual toy one day. You got hold of it, didn't you? That's right, I have it now. Really? And that's when the game begins. So, the moment that they find Utena in the cathedral, that's when all of this starts. It often happens that a relationship becomes stifling because of a shared past, which is Saionji and Toga. Even if you have no particular interest in a toy, when you find out he has it, you think, I need it too. They say that in that world, only one princess is chosen. So to me, interpreting that, it's like Saionji saw Toga have this, developed relationship with Utena, even though it wasn't really defined, and wanted the same thing, so thought they could get the same thing with Anthy. But in the end, Anthy is the one that ends up getting chosen to have the power of Dios. So there's stuff afoot in this commentary that is connecting to where we are now. It's just like, when is it all gonna tie together, if it is gonna tie together in any clean way? But I was like, oh yes. So yeah, the idea that this all began finding Utena in the cathedral, I think is really, really important. So that's all well and good. Thank you all for the comments. But here's the part where it gets crazy, because I've been on Twitter and there's been this meme pop up, okay? And the meme is that they have like this little, it looks like it was done on Microsoft Paint. It was like, do you like stars? Yes, I do. And it was like two characters sitting on a hill looking up at the moon and stars. I don't exactly know the origins of the meme, but I've seen lots of renditions of it and I've been sharing them in the Discord. So this one popped up from The Little Prince, which is at th0785 on Twitter. You can look it up there. This popped up. I have not read The Little Prince, but the thing that caught my eye was that, one, there's the rose in the jar. And I was like, we just watched episode 13 where there was a rose in a glass box. And I was like, oh, wait a minute. And then the character that plays the Little Prince, his outfit is like green and red, like the rose, but also ties to like the uniform style in this series. And I was like, wait a minute. And The Little Prince was written in the 1940s. It's a French children's story. So it is very highly likely that the creators of Utena have read The Little Prince. It's been around for 80 years. So I was like, huh. So I don't know The Little Prince, but I went and looked it up. And I specifically wanted to look up the plot as it relates to the rose in the jar. And so it says here, the story follows a young prince, and this is highly paraphrasing. I've left out chunks that I didn't think were relevant to this discussion. I'm just including the parts that I thought were relevant. So this story follows a young prince who visits various planets, including Earth, and addresses the themes of loneliness, friendship, love, and loss. Despite its style as a children's book, The Little Prince makes observations about life, adults, and human nature. Well, that just ties into Revolutionary Girls so well, because we just had in the last episode the thought of aliens, of visiting Earth, the idea of loneliness, friendship, love, and loss. Those themes are all tying into this series very heavily. So it says later on in the story, the prince met a rose that grew on an asteroid. The rose exaggerated ailments to have the prince take care of her, which kind of reminds me of Utena being like, I'm gonna die in the cathedral and in the coffin, and they kind of pep her up and cheer her up, and then the prince on the white horse cheers her up. The prince made a screen and glass globe to protect her from the cold and wind, watered her, and kept the caterpillars off. Despite falling in love with the rose, the prince also began to feel she was taking advantage of him and resolved to leave the planet to explore the rest of the universe. Now, we don't know about this taking advantage of. There's been lots of people take advantage of Anthy, so maybe possibly, but I don't think Anthy's taken advantage of anybody, and Utena hasn't really taken advantage of anybody either. So that part's left to be seen. But upon saying their goodbyes, the rose apologized for failing to show that she loved him. She wished him well and turned down his desires to leave her in the glass globe, saying she would protect herself. The prince laments that he did not understand how to love his rose while being with her. So for me, it's like the idea of the rose choosing to protect herself very much seems like it ties to Utena, and the prince not understanding how to love her or what to do while he was with her. Does that connect to the prince? Does it connect to Toga? Does it connect to Saionji? Like there's so many things I feel like could kind of connect, right? So it also says the prince had since visited 6 other planets that were each inhabited by an adult. But I was like, you have Mickey and Juri and Saionji and Nanami and Kiryu, but that's only 5 people, so that's not 6 people. So I'm like, I don't know if Anthy makes sense with it all. We might wait till later to discuss that further. I'm going to plan on making a motif with the little prince and keep it going because I'm very curious about all of that. But anyway, they also talk about how the prince, he landed in the desert believing Earth was uninhabited, and he met a snake that claimed to have the power to return him to his home if he ever wished for that. The prince next met a flower who said he'd only seen a few men in that part of the world, and they had no roots, letting the wind blow them around and living hard lives. After climbing to the highest mountain he'd ever seen, the prince hoped to see the whole of the earth and find it with people, but he only saw a desolate landscape. And when he called out, his echo answered him, which he interpreted as the voice of someone boring who only repeats words. This to me felt a lot like Toga, because Toga, it seems like Toga wanted the power. Like, maybe the snake, did Toga know the guy with the pale lavender hair too with the red jacket? Because they act very similar. Did Toga know him? Is the red jacket man the snake? He has like a little rat tail that kind of could be like a snake. Is he the snake? Did he promise Toga he would like help him, and that was like the end of the world? And then Toga met Utena and thought that she was connected to all of this. The whole thing about the voice echoing reminds me of the cassette player where it's repeating his words over and over again, which would tie to that. I'm just saying. And then it said that the prince encountered a row of rose bushes, becoming downcast at having once thought that his rose was unique and thinking she had lied about being unique. He began to feel like he was not a great prince, and his planet only contained 3 tiny volcanoes and a flower that he now thought of as common. And he started weeping until a fox came along. The fox desired to be tamed and taught the prince how to tame him. By being tamed, something goes from being ordinary and just like all the other things to being special and unique. Which sounds kind of counterintuitive because you're like, well, wait, how does that work? But by being tamed, if something's feral, it doesn't have individuality. It doesn't have identity. It's just a feral being that's no different, like a pack of dogs that don't have individual personalities. They're just a pack of dogs. But once they become domesticated, you start to see from being around them their individual personalities, and they start to become more unique and special, right? So they have names and all that. And so the fox in the story is kind of like that. I don't know exactly where the fox metaphor fits into all this, if it does, but from the fox, the prince learns that his rose was indeed special because she was the object of his love and time. He had tamed her, quote unquote. This wrote in the 1940s, so, you know. And now she was more precious than all the other roses, which means he just liked her. He figured out that even if she wasn't different from the other roses, she was his rose, so that's why he liked her. And that can kind of maybe tap into Utena and Anthy. We can go a lot of different directions with it. Is it Toga and Utena? Upon their departing, the fox says the important things can only be seen with the heart, not the eyes. I really kind of want the fox to be Saionji and for him to teach Toga this lesson, but who knows? Is the red jacket man the fox? Who knows? The narrator later finds the prince talking to the snake, which I think might be the red jacket man, discussing his return home and his desire to see his rose again, worrying she might have been left to fend for herself. So I don't know if that could be if the prince could be the prince on the egg that we saw in the last episode, or if it's referring to Toga. I think the snake is the red-jacketed man, and the rose could be Anthy, or it could be Utena. But the prince bids farewell to the narrator and states that if he looks as if he's died, it's only because his body was too heavy to take with him to the planet. He basically commits suicide to go back and see the rose. Or so we think. Or maybe he transgresses through time and space and goes and sees her that way. It's a fictional story. It's a fantasy. Who knows? But the prince warns the narrator not to watch him leave, as it will upset him. The narrator realizes what will happen and refuses to leave the prince's side. The prince says that the narrator only needs to look at the stars and think of the prince's laughter, and it will seem as if all the stars are laughing. The prince then walks away and allows the snake to bite him, falling down. So the snake bites him, and that's supposed to let him go back to see his rose, but essentially it's killing him, right? It seems very melancholy, right? So I don't know if that means that Toga is potentially going to get in a situation where he makes a deal with the Red Jacket Man to try to get Anthy or to try. And the rose to Toga may not represent Anthy or Utena. It may just represent his desires. And he's made a deal with the Red Jacketed Man to get those desires. I'm assuming a lot without knowing things that are going to happen. But this whole Prince story, I was like, the rose in the glass box has got me on this like giant trail. And so I don't know what's going to happen or if we're going to get anything remotely related to this. I could have just given you 10 minutes of BS and it's not even going to be a thing. But I thought it was interesting and we've wasted 15 minutes. So what can we do? But in any case, I'm excited to see what happens this episode. Starting Act 2, we might as well see. So we're going to start episode 14 of Revolutionary Girl Utena. And we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1. And let's go. What? These are my favorite types of series where it's bonkers. They don't give you answers, but there's so much that you're like, what? We've got to try to piece this together, make it work. They're not going to outright tell you what things mean. And I was like, that's what I love. I'm really drawn to stories that have a lot of abstract concepts and abstract thematic elements and symbolism, because there's so many opportunities of ways you can connect it, and there's so many interpretations and things you can draw from, and everybody in the comments can have different interpretations too. Those are the type of stories that I love. That's why I love Neon Genesis, because it very much is abstract, subjective thought on a lot of different themes. There are some things that are pretty obvious, but there's other things that you're like, well, maybe it means this, but it could mean that. And I feel like this series it introduced you to the main characters. It got you on board with them. It said, here's this fun little wacky concept. Now, what if we took the dial and we just kind of cranked it a little bit? And I'm like, yeah, crank that dial. Yes. So I can definitely see where Anno watched this and went, oh my God, absolutely. We want to do the same thing. So there is a lot that I want to talk about. I went ahead and put some stuff up here on Whiteboard Coon because I think there's some stuff I wanted to go ahead and put out there, and then we'll kind of go through this academy, its research facilities, its architecture. And here's the thing, this academy is so huge that there are parts of it that Utena has not gone to. So she's like, oh yeah, I didn't know we had a research facility, this random hall. Didn't know we had that. And sure enough, they did. There was such a Sailor Moon vibe to this episode too, and I was like, oh, we getting into like, because Ukuhara worked on Sailor Moon, I'm like, are we getting into like some Negaverse? Like just, it felt very much like Zoisite and like Nephlite. It felt very much like, if I'm being honest, in season 1, Jediite started to use a lot of things to try to get energy for, you know, the Negaverse and for Queen Beryl and all that. And I'm like, okay, cool. But this very much felt like the way they created villains in Sailor Moon. And I'm like, oh, what a nostalgia trip. I'm all here for it. So let's talk about this episode. Before we get started, what we know about, we're going to talk about Mikage Soji and him and his, his groom. We're going to talk about them for sure. But so we know the prince. The prince is up in the castle. He is trapped up there on his little egg. He has the power of Dios, but he's trapped in the castle. And part of the goal is to break him out, or at least that's what I assume part of the goal is. We're trying to get him out of the castle. That's part of the thing. He's trapped up there. Akio, who is Anthy's brother, with giant heavy quotation marks, he believes that Utena could herald the rebirth of Dios's power. So he's on board with Utena being used for his purposes, because he believes that the prince, Akio, I need to make another line to this. Akio also believes in this sense that he is only going to benefit from Utena revolutionizing this power. He thinks that whatever ends up happening is only going to help him. He says it's going to benefit the both of them, but it's mainly he thinks it's going to benefit him. So Akio seems very much like, kind of like Toga, in that Akio is just working for Akio's sake. He does not care about anybody else. He just wants to further his own advancement. It's like, cool. Anyway, we're going to talk about him throughout this for sure. But, So he knows about the prince being trapped up there. He believes that Utena could herald the power of rebirth of Dios's. He could herald the rebirth of Dios's power. So he's fine with this because he said it's going to benefit him if everything goes according to plan. And we know Utena can channel the prince's power and or soul to help her win these battles. So it appears that Akio, here's the thing, we have these opposing forces now. Mikage seems in direct contrast with Akio. They seem indirect. They seem like they are rivals against one another. Mikage wants to, I'm going to put a question mark by their name, wants to let this person that looks surprisingly like the prince and surprisingly like Anthy and Akio, but isn't either one of them, he wants them to become the Rose Bride. And then he wants to have the power of Dios as well. He's like if Kiryu was jacked up on steroids. Right? So he very much wants the power of Dios for himself. Kind of like, it seems like Soji wants to become a version of Akio, and he wants a Rose Bride of his own. He wants his lover to become the Rose Bride, which we'll talk about. And we'll go into that whole scenario about gender and everything with the Rose Bride. But they are very much against each other. So it's interesting because Utena wants to keep Anthy safe as a friend right now anyway. Akio's like, sure, I have no problem with Utena because she's in the dark. She doesn't know about me and Anthy and all of this stuff. I'm going to use Utena to get what I want. She can access the power of the prince. I'm going to use that to my advantage. And I'm going to have to keep Anthy the Rose Bride to do it. And she's his sister. So there's an avenue with that as well. Which I think is interesting because I was comparing Akio to Toga, and then you have Toga with his sister Nanami, you have Akio with his sister Anthy. And it's just kind of the polar opposite where Nanami has this incredible adoration towards Toga to the point where it's obsession. Anthy is going along with everything, but I think that's because she doesn't have a choice. And we're going to talk about that later. Or maybe she does. We'll talk about it later. But he knows all about everything that's going on. Utena does not think that Akio knows what's going on. So there's the big disconnect. Utena's like, let's not involve your brother because we don't want to get him caught up in all this. And the thing that is so wild to me is that Anthy's like, okay. And the thing that's so wild about that is that it makes sense because Utena's like, let's not involve your brother. And Anthy's like, well, I have to do what you say. So sure, we're not going to involve my brother. And I'm like, that's because she has to listen to your orders. So if Utena finds out anything suspicious about Akio and she asks Anthy to tell her about Akio, by the logic of the duels and how the Rose Bride works, Anthy will have to tell Utena about Akio. So at this point, we just have to wait until Utena gets curious enough to be like, how about you tell me a little bit about your brother? Does he know about all this? And then Utena will be required, based on the world building we've set up, to tell her. But right now, because Utena thinks that he doesn't know, she's like, well, let's not get him involved. And Anthy's like, okay, sure, we won't. And I'm like, damn it, no! Because that's the thing about it is, I was going to wait till the end of the episode, but we might as well bring it up now and we'll touch back on it later. I don't think Anthy wants to get with her brother at all. Her brother is like, I think they're all aliens. I think they're all aliens. And I think that it's like a Magenta and Riff Raff from Rocky Horror where they touch elbows and like sing, let's do the time warp again. And there's this weird kind of incestuous relationship between them. Unlike Rocky Horror where it's mutual. I don't think it's mutual. I think that Akio, because he's tapping into the power of Dios and is her brother, I think he's like sexually assaulting her and harassing her because he can and he has that power and authority. And she can't resist. And the fact that she takes off her glasses at the end and sets them on the table, to me, that's symbolic of she doesn't want to see this happen. She doesn't want to visualize it. So she takes off her glasses so it's blurry. Right? And she sees him once a week. And it's like, that's what's been going on. And Utena doesn't even know. And you may be asking as the audience, well, why doesn't Anthy speak up about it? Well, this is kind of ahead of its time considering when this came out. But one, the world building that has been established doesn't give Anthy the opportunity to speak up about it because that's just how the world building is. She can't speak up unless it's brought up. she's very quiet and reserved and silenced on everything else, which is why when Kane is like, well, I'm going to get married to your brother. And she's like, sure, Jan. It's like, yeah, that's how this works. But also it seems like it's a commentary on, and knowing from experience, if you've ever been someone that's been assaulted or been sexually harassed or something, there is a part of you that you don't want to speak up about it because you're afraid that one, the person won't believe you, or two, it's going to retaliate in a negative manner where it's just going to make matters worse. And that could be a big part of it because Anthy may know how powerful her brother is and she doesn't want Utena to get hurt. So she's like, I'll just keep going along with this and I'll keep doing what he tells me to do and I'll keep letting him assault me because I don't want Utena to get hurt because I care about her. And her putting on the smile and going along with it, even when it's something horrible happening to her, I mean, that's a pretty powerful message that I think transcends the show and speaks to a lot of people in the real world that are in those same scenarios. There's lots of reasons why people cover it up and don't talk about it. And this is like an illustration of that. But when he says, have you been lonely this week? And she says, yes. I feel like to me, one, it signifies what he's doing to her, which is gross. Even if they are aliens, she's not consensual. She seems like we don't know her consensual. It doesn't read as consensual, but she's forced to go there because it's her brother and he has power over her, whatever. But to me, it also signifies that maybe she is lonely and she wants someone to love her romantically, maybe, and she's not getting that. So maybe that's why she goes along with it partially. We don't know. But to me, that means that later on in the series, if Utena and her do get together, then that's going to be a problem for Akio if suddenly Anthy's like, actually, no, I wasn't lonely this week. I was with somebody that cared about me more than just a friend. Then that might change things, but it was, oh man. Anyway, so I also like the idea, we're going to go back and talk about the Black Rose growing in darkness, but we have Anthy as the Rose Bride with the power of Dios and her growing the roses during the light. That there's that comparison. And then obviously Akio is marrying into the Otari family to run the school. Yeah, that part I was like, oh my God, he's marrying into the family so he can control this entire academy. Oh, bitch. So anyway, we start out this episode with this hall, this numero hall, right? We're going to tie it up here. Numero uno hall. That is also a crematorium. Just in case if you were wondering. And also for research. I guess, does this academy also have college campuses on it? That wouldn't surprise me. Or a research hall. So underneath, like the stairs, the architecture of this building is wild. But underneath the underground, I love that we travel downward and there's the elevators and everything. Also, I like the idea that unlike the academy where the elevators are very open-fronted, where you can see through and they're transparent, the elevators here are closed in. Creepy. So that glass is basically like hydroponics. It's like a black rose growing in water. And there's this man, assuming, that is sitting there touching the rose that's crying into it. It seems like they're crying into the rose. They have lavender hair like Anthy and like Akio. And it says, how is it that the rose can bloom in the depths of the earth so far outside the sun's reach? I'm fascinated by like the pink and magenta uniform that this character wears. I'm very fascinated. How can it bloom in such depths? And it says, my black rose absorbs the darkness. So whoever this mystery person is, they have a black rose. And it absorbs darkness. So, like Anthy is growing the rose in the sunlight, they're growing this rose in the darkness. Now, are Anthy and this man twins? Is he another brother of Akio? They're not I thought for a second they were the prince, but they're not. They're another one. Are they all siblings? I don't know. But it's growing wild. And it says, senpai, I've heard Council President Kiryu has been missing from school as of late. We'll talk about Soji, but Soji very much has they remind me a little bit of, they're from Hunter x Hunter. I haven't watched Hunter x Hunter all the way through and it's been so long. Is it Copernica from Hunter x Hunter. They remind me a little bit in their design of that. But interesting. They also have the dot just like Anthy on their head. The one in the lavender, the magenta uniform. They haven't been coming to school as of late. That's why the academy's been so quiet recently. Mm-hmm. And so then, and also they have glossy lips, the one with the magenta suit. So we're talking about subverting gender. They have a soft-spoken voice. I don't know if it's a voice actress playing their voice or not, but they have like the glossy lips, the suit's magenta. They have kind of an effeminate presence, but whenever Soji's like, you're going to be the Rose Bride, they're like, you mean Rose Groom. So even though they have this effeminate appearance, they present themselves as male. And also Soji has a black ring on, which is interesting. So they present themselves as male, but they're definitely messing around with Soji. There is some messing around going on. In the mausoleum of dead bodies, no less, you freaks. So yes, they are the lover of Soji. Whether they want to or not, we don't know for sure. And Soji has one of the black rose seals, which we come to find out are the rings of the dead. Whenever a duelist dies, their ring turns black, which is horrific. Okay, cool. Talk about that. A proper academy should be a peaceful place of study. So, they didn't like Kiryu messing around. They were like, this whole business with duels and everything was a bit much. Nobody likes it. We don't want these duels. Soji wants things to be peaceful and quote-unquote normal. Just wants it to be a place of research and study. He's like, I'm tired of all these shenanigans. And then they disappear. What we do? So Boys of the Black Rose. All right. God, this is crazy. So anyway, back at the so inside, it's the tower, right? The tower is the tower that is where the planetarium, around where all the student councils are meeting, is where Anthy and them are meeting up. And they meet up on Saturdays. Ugh. Just gives me like a shudder that this whole time, she's been meeting him every weekend this whole time. And that's the crazy part, is that I don't know if Kiryu knew about it. I don't know if Saionji knew about it. I don't know if I guess she disappeared while she was with the rest of them and they didn't question it. But I think that's something to be said of as well, that things are getting introduced in the story that we, the audience, didn't know anything about because it was never brought up. But it was still happening regardless. So she's been visiting him in this whole time and nobody knew. I also like the fact that Utena's been like, I've been going to all these wicked raving house parties on the weekend with Wakaba. I've been hanging out with my friends. But she's like, him and me as a homebody, so she never went. And then she came back and there we were. I'm so, it feels so 90s to have like the school house parties. Like they're having a frat party and like Wakaba's got like a beer bong or something. I know that's not the case. But anyway, she's like, I go there at least once a week. And she's like, oh, my brother. And she's like, wait, you have a brother? So then they go up to the top of the tower. They take the elevator, as it were. And she's like, excuse us. And she's like, wrong floor. And she's like, nope, this is right. This giant satellite, this giant telescope to look at the stars in the planetarium. It's just screaming alien. It's just screaming they're from another planet. They've come down here to take over. It feels wild. I'm getting Madoka Magica flashbacks, the power of Dios. There's something on this planet that's getting accessed. Now, when they go to, I like that at first Utena's like, is this your brother? About the projector. I feel like Utena didn't exactly know if by Anthy saying she went and saw her brother every weekend, if she's like, did you just come to the planetarium and hang out? I like how she just was like, you just didn't want to tell me you were like hanging out in the planetarium. You could have said something. Like, she tried to make a joke out of it, and Anthy's like, no, this is just the projector, not my actual brother. He's a person. Now, when we saw the people messing under there, we saw him cleaning the planetarium, and then we zoom in on them, and he like has his back turned and he's like making out with her. We came at a bad time. It's like scandalous. I thought for a hot second it was the tails because like the little ball on the back of Akio's hair looked like a bun, and I thought it was like the bun from the tails. I thought it was the tails making out, and we were like seeing something in on that. I was like, oh my god, we actually can see what they look like. No, instead it was Akio and Kane, and yeah, and Utena's like, let's leave them alone. And he, like, is very possessive. Like, he grabs her and, like, brings her closer. And she's like, let's scram before we get in the way. But then the elevator doesn't work. And he's like, well, hi, how are you? The other factor that tells me that Anthy was going to get, like, assaulted by Akio at the end is that his tie is undone and his shirt is open. So I don't know if he just got done seeing Kane and now he's seeing Anthy. I don't know. But it had a very sexual nature to it. And it was very, very suggestive. So he's like, well, how do you do? I find it funny. He's like, I'm Otori Akio. I find it interesting that the flowers are pink like Utena's over him. Now, Otori is Kane's last name, which he's adopted because he's betrothed and going to get married to them. So in Japan, the men don't always take, women don't always take the surname from their husbands. In Japan, it can go vice versa. You can get adopted into the wife's family just as easily. So he very much is wanting to get adopted into the Otari family so he can take over the academy. Like, that's nefarious. And she's like, oh, sorry for seeing you. He's like, oh, no, we're glad you came. And he's like, my sister never introduced me to one of her friends, so I'm super happy. She's like, your brother's the board chairman. He's like, oh, I'm only acting board chairman. He's like, we've just recently come in and slightly taken over. It's like, ah! So he's like, the actual board chairman is Kane's father. Yeah. So Akio's pretty old. Like, he's graduated high school, clearly. His voice and them tight black pants, he already seems like slime, but I'm like, damn it. It's unfortunate, that he couldn't be nicer. And she's like, my father's super fond of Akio and plans to let me marry him as soon as I graduate from high school. I'm like, girl, he's already adopted him into your family, She's like, he's like, well, I keep telling her it's too soon, but I never thought the board chairman's office would look like this. He's like, my passion is in stargazing. She's like, oh yeah, he likes it so much it's almost abnormal. I'm like, ha 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 ha. Some people think he got himself adopted into my family just for the access to the equipment. It's like, oh, well, no, he got adopted into your family exactly for that purpose. He got adopted into the family so you could have access to all this. Don't you worry. I'm like, girl. And we're just the audience watching this all go down. But she's like, I hear he stayed here again last night. And he's like, oh, I find the stars lovely. And I use a telescope to observe the stars I've come to know. And they tell me their hidden selves. And for a second, I feel like Utena's like, wait a minute. I'm like, he was here last night. She doesn't put two and two together, right? And she's like, well, spare a thought for me once in a while, would you? And the way that he says, I would play it again for you, but I don't want to get this struck for copyright. When he's like, if I discover a comet, I'll name it after you. The way that he said that, the whisper tone that he said that, he is smooth, dangerously smooth. Like with Kiryu Toga, it comes off as a lot. And I feel like Utena could instantly be like, But here, he's so smooth and subtle about it. It's dangerous. It's very dangerous. And so Utena looks over to Anthy and she's just smiling the whole time, but not saying anything about any of this. Which Utena's like, okay, what are we supposed to do now that they're having this moment? He's like, well, I haven't been here long, but there is something that I know for sure. The students of this academy are all free spirits and have a love for learning. And they never fight. And I was like, womp, womp, womp. But see, that's so strategic on his part because he's planting in Utena's head that he doesn't know anything about the duels. And Utena's sitting there going, okay, well, he doesn't know that there's all these duels going on. I don't want to get him and Kane involved in all this, so I probably shouldn't mention it to him. And I was like, that was so strategic. Like, he just instantly did that to take advantage of the situation. And the way that he just kind of looks at her and be like, they never fight, correct? And she's like, I hope it stays that way. I was like, girl, I would have mentioned the duels, but of course she doesn't want to. And they're like, nothing bad ever happens at Otari Academy. And then later, 20 minutes later, we have a cremation of a dead body. And I was like, okay, just wild. Absolutely wild. And as they say that, whoever mystery person plucks the black rose out of the hydroponics. And they're like, we'll see you again, Kane. She's like, oh, well, you can call me sister, you know. And she's like, after all, I'll be formally your big sister very soon. Right? And the way she says right, and it slowly zooms in on Anthy, like, sure. Like, no, you're not, bitch. I'm like, oh my God. I was like, this family of aliens is using them to get to this power of Dios. Like, I'm getting Rocky Horror flashbacks. I'm just telling y'all. Also, this is the first episode we don't see the Tells. The Tells are nowhere to be seen. So I don't know what happened to them, if they're not allowed to come on the show anymore, but it was a little bit unnerving that they weren't here at all. There was no segue. There was a moment that we saw where they usually pop up at, but they did not this episode. And I was like, oh my God. Like, they got in their spaceship and they legit went away. I was like, oh. So, Mikage-kun, they're like, thanks to your paper. So we see, I can't tell on the screen what Mikage is looking at, what Soji's looking at, but there is, it looks like somebody in a helmet, looks like maybe someone with a fencing sword. And they're like, thanks. And then he's just basically, this is like a microfiche reader, right? Is it an old computer or a microfiche reader? And he's just looking through old papers. I can't determine for sure, but he's got like Post-it notes taped to it. I love grungy animation from the 90s, and this is feeding my need for that. And they're like, well, thanks to your paper. And he's got like he's looking, I mean, it's an old school computer, but he's looking through all these documents and everything. He's got boxes of books and everything. And these two men are there. They're like, thanks to your paper, our research lab got picked up for the advisory board. So he's got a lot of push and pull. So he has a lot of research pool in the community. It seems like he's trying to discover more info about probably Akio in this whole situation, because he seems like he wants to know what's going on. And he's like, well, that was not my paper. It was your work, professor. And he's like, well, give him the gift. I like that they're like, you know, because of your influence. He's like, it was your paper, not my influence. So they try to like bribe him and give him a gift. And they're like, well, my wife went to the hot spring resort the other day. Also, he has a picture of the lavender-haired man on his desk. I'm like, if it was reading very Sionji, like, this is my lover, get away from me. Like, my wife went to the hot spring resort the other day, and she said, you just have to try these. So he gives him manju, and I'm like, but why? And he's like, doesn't answer it. He doesn't accept the bribe. And he's like, come on. He's like, well, forgive me for beating around the bush. This is only a pittance, but please accept it. So I give him like a credit card, like a bank card. And he's like, there's no need for such concern. I may call upon your help someday soon. And they're like, well, we'll count on you then. So he takes the card and the thing and leaves. He's like, oh, well, anything. Consider anything within our power already done. So basically, they leave and they have this exposition off screen, which is Anno did a lot of that in Neon Genesis, which it's just like, it makes you pay attention. You're like, what are they talking about? But my mind was just, there was so much going on. I was like, we're going to go back through this. So he has resources in the adult world. And I think that's important to note, because with Toga, he had a lot of influence from the high school perspective, like being on president of student council, all this. This guy seems older, and he seems like maybe he's a third year, and this is him like in his research period, and he's like writing his thesis or whatever, and he's like looking at universities, who knows. But he has influence in the adult world, which is huge. So he's taking this beyond just Otori Academy. There's like a bigger picture scenario going on with Soji. So, and this guy tries to bribe him, and he's like, no. He's like, I'm not accepting your bribe. Just know whenever I want something from you, you'll give it to me. And the guy's like, oh, of course. And interesting. So then they have this conversation off screen as he's researching. They're like, that was the charismatic high schooler who hosts the Mikage seminar. Okay, so he is in high school, probably a third year. And he has this Mikage seminar. What an overpowering aura. I almost lost my nerve. It's known as the Black Rose Society. So our cult is the Mikage seminar, or Black Rose Society. And what do they say about that? His seminar class. They even have a minister amongst the ranks, and odds are it's true. So they have a minister. I don't know if that's supposed to be the lavender-haired person. Not exactly sure. But he's in this research hall with a bunch of dead bodies. That shouldn't be surprising to any of us. After all, the entire faculty reaps benefits by associating with him. So Soji, we don't know if Soji is kind of like Kiryu in that he comes from a wealthy family and has political power and pull, and the faculty kind of let him do whatever he wants because they get something out of it. I don't know. He is looking at microfiche. Okay, that's not a computer, it's a microfiche reader. For those of you that don't know, they like look at little cells and pictures and datas and stuff that's held on microfilm. It's from the 80s. It is a very outdated technology. You can find like a reader on eBay if you're lucky. The school I work at has some because we have transcripts from the 80s that are only on microfiche. So you have to like pull it up and read it with the microfiche reader. And so I've seen one of those used before. But yeah, it's old school tech. Very old school tech. But yeah, the genius high schooler Mikage Soji. So then there's Mika, which I'm not surprised that Mika was summoned by Soji. Soji's like, I want smart people to work with me. And he tried to recruit Mika from middle school. But Mika, good for you for turning him down. Good for you! Mika's like, no, I think we're good. I love the symbolism of the column, which has the rose print design embedded in it. I love these like little chase loungers that they're sitting back having a soda. I love it. Also, Soji having like the legs crossed in the very much heterosexual pose that he's in. Definitely. Also, like we talked about the doors in the last episode, there's like little bits of the mosaic on the windows that's lit up, but not all of it. So he's like, well, have you thought about, joining my group? Also, I want to note that Soji's uniform looks a lot like Utena's, which is interesting to me. Only it's black instead of white. And Miki's like, well, thank you, but I'm just not qualified to be part of your seminar. And he's like, well, I was looking for a smart mind like yours, but guess that won't work. It is what it is. And Miki's like, yeah, all I can do is accept it. He's like, well, let me know if you change your mind. I'll make it worth your while. He's like, thanks, but no thanks. Good for him. Dodged a bullet, for sure. He would have been made into a Black Rose duelist. Let's not have that happen. So yeah, Utena's like, we're just walking by this building we've never been by before. And so Utena and them, Anthy says, thanks for not telling my brother about my secrets. And so that line is interesting to me because that comes out of nowhere. Utena did not encourage her to have that conversation. Anthy says that on her own. So I'm very curious about that line because we know that Akio knows about all this. I'm like, does Anthy really think that he doesn't know? Or is she trying to keep Utena safe by keeping her out of it and saying, hey, thanks for not bringing it up to my brother. We don't want to get him involved because she's afraid that Utena will get hurt if that happens. Or maybe Anthy is afraid that Utena will get taken away from her by Akio if that happens. Maybe she's afraid if Akio feels Utena's a threat to them that he'll get rid of her or hurt her. And Anthy's like, I don't want that to happen, so I'm going to keep her away from me. Anthy is very mysterious and a little devious. And I'm like, oh, there's stuff about Anthy that I'm like, how much of this is against her free will and how much of it is her free will? And we don't exactly know the answers to these questions yet. But she's like, I don't want him to know anything that might upset him. Yeah, that's the thing. She doesn't want Akio to get mad because she's being pressured into a horrible situation and she doesn't want to make it worse. And I'm like, that does not, that reads like abuser coded. I don't like it at all. And Utena doesn't know what's going on. So she's like, I don't want him knowing about me being the Rose Bride, the duelist code. She's like, I gotcha. She's like, yeah, we should keep that stuff from your brother. She's like, Kane seems nice too, and I don't want her to get mixed up in all this. And I'm like, So then they happen to go by there, and that's when Miki sees them, and he's like, hey, what are you guys doing? He's like, aren't you supposed to be free today? And like, we went to visit him and Mia's big brother. And Miki knew about him. He's like, oh, the board chairman. I'm like, everybody knew about him except for us. And Utena, apparently, everybody just knows about him. And Utena's like, oh, well, what are you up to, Miki? And he's like, well, I had to look up something in the archives. Okay, so the Numero Hall is an archive. Okay, fancy that. It's like a library. Okay, like the library on campus. Okay. And so like, oh, wow. And like, you like studying even on your days off. And she's like, I didn't know this place even existed. And then we had the stopwatch coming in with the 17. I was like, ugh. Yep. She's like, I didn't even know this existed. I'm like, they just had to bring that stopwatch in. They're like, you didn't know about Numero Memorial Hall? Like, we should know about this? This building has a rather unfortunate history. And that's when she's like, what do you mean unfortunate history? And that's when we see the shot of the men looking up from below. All of them apparently tried to become duelists and they died. What? There's 100 men buried alive. So then that brings up the question, how long has this been going on? How long has all this been happening? Why are there 100 men here? Why aren't the cops called? Why is nobody doing anything about this? A long time ago, 100 boys were buried alive here. What? How long is a long time ago? How were they buried alive? How do they know that they were buried alive? Why did no one try to excavate them? What? What a rumor, right? And so then we go to all the pair of shoes, right? Because we're in the mausoleum. We're with all the bodies. All the cadavers are down here in the morgue. And there's all the 100 pair of shoes. And Mamiya! That's his name! Mamiya. Himamiya and Mamiya. What? I want to look up Mamiya. I'm going to try not to be spoiled. Mamiya name meaning. Divine Valley. Oh, okay. It means Divine Valley. Wow. And Himamiya name meaning means a shrine or palace. So a valley and a palace. Oh my God. Are they twins? Maybe they're twins. Maybe they're related. Himamiya and Mamiya sound like twin names. They sound like twin names. Like that would be what your twins would be named. Mamiya and Himamiya. Okay. Okay. But then you have Anthy, so that's where it gets weird. Okay. What? Or maybe they're not twins, but they're like of the same people. We don't know what Akio's surname was. If it was Himamiya, we assume it was Himamiya, but maybe Mamiya is just, they're like just relatives, or they're just neighbors. They're from the same planet, you know? They're like, well, it seems you're eligible to be the Rose Bride. Oh, and he's like, well, don't you mean groom? I also like the fact that Soji is wearing a pair of the same shoes that are lined up against the mausoleum. So that makes me think that Soji found this place, took one of the rings from the bodies, and put on a pair of the shoes to become part of this whole thing. So when Mamiya says, don't you mean groom? He's like, I am a boy after all. And Mamiya's wearing a pair of the same shoes as well. And they're like, well, bride suits you better. To me, the line bride suits you better tells me that if we're just saying it, Soji's the top. If we're just saying it, is what that tells me. Is what that tells me. And just like in Toga and the twin sister in the piano scene, you have Mamiya putting back on the jacket after those two probably clearly did something. I'm just saying that that's how it reads to me, that these two are having some situations with one another. Like, I will make you into a true Rose Bride. I'll attain the power of Dios and make the secret of eternity ours. Okay, so apparently the secret of eternity is tied up in all this. No big deal. That actually makes sense if Mamiya is not related to Anthy, because part of Soji's plan is to kill Anthy. And if she was his twin sister, then it'd be like, well, you're killing your twin sister. Are you okay with that? But if Mamiya is just a member of that race and they're like, we're gonna have to kill Anthy, they're gonna be like, okay, so I can become the Rose Bride. And he's like, I'm gonna get the power of Dios. And he's like, if you say so, senpai. I know what I'm doing. The end of the world has acknowledged us. So we don't know how the end of the world factors into all this, how that acknowledgement works. We don't know that entirely yet. But to do all of this, we must defeat Tenjo Utena and obtain Himamiya Anthy. And then kill her. Okay. So, basically, Soji wants to basically do like what Utena is doing and have the power to channel the prince and have that power of Dios, which is what Kiryu wanted at one time. And so Mamiya, in turn, Soji thinks that they can become the Rose Bride like Anthy. And they're like, okay, but in order to, apparently there can only be one Rose Bride. It's Highlander, there can be only one. Only one Rose Bride, so they need to get a hold of Anthy and kill her. And then, presumably, Mamiya will be able to become the Rose Bride after that. This seems like some alien shenanigans. But, okay. And then Mamiya's like, yes. To that end, we'll need a strong duelist to get her. So then, Kane shows up. And she was there, and she rings the little reception desk at the archive and says, I have an appointment for an interview today. So, interviewees, please fill out a form and await your turn. So, she's there for an interview, and it says, interview reception. Please fill out the following details. So, it says, Kane Otari, 18 years old, female, Kanagawa Prefecture. So, as far as what she was interning for, or interviewing for, I'm assuming it was to either legit work there or she was wanting to be part of the society. And this was like the secret way in. Like, it's kind of like a speakeasy where you're like, are you here for the interview? Wink, wink. And she's like, yes, wink, wink. And then they let her down into the basement to see what's going on. But I don't think she fully understood what was happening or what was going to happen. So I also like that I'm realizing now her hair is actually not blonde, but it's more greenish. I thought it was more blonde when they met her in the planetarium, but it looked green here as well. The whole thing with the chairs and the hands in the chairs pointing to the elevator, bitch, that is some kooky, abstract art symbolism. I am here for it. I was like, oh yes, this is going to get bonkers. This is going to get wild. I love it. They push her to the door where the door shuts, and then she gets in the elevator. So we see the butterfly, right? We see the green butterfly, and then it changes. They're like, please begin. She's like, well, as soon as I graduate, I'm getting married. He seems very gentle. He can be a little childish, but he's much more mature than I am. So it feels like it's an arranged marriage, but she's okay with it because he seems nice. But she doesn't like Anthy. She's like, I'd do anything for him. But, and they're like, well, go deeper. What's bothering you? And she's like, he has a younger sister, and no matter how hard I try, I can't bring myself to like her. And then it seems like everything's going backwards. It's like the butterfly goes back to being in the chrysalis, and then goes back to being the caterpillar and the larva, and it's like, oh my god. Yep. It's like regressing back to, and I don't know if that's the butterfly and the symbolism of the butterfly going in reverse is a sign of her desires, like going back to the root of her desires. She just doesn't trust Anthy, and she doesn't feel accepted by Anthy, and she feels like something's off because of her, and she's not going to be happy until she either accepts her or is out of the picture. And she's like, I gave her my scarf to use, and she said thank you and wiped her glasses with it. And I'm like, well, that sounds like an alien thing to do. So, that's just Anthy. I can't help but thinking. And then she talks about, and my father, I can't help but thinking that his falling ill coincides when that pest started to come to our house. So now she's blaming Anthy for her father taking ill, which, what a coincidence. What a coinky-dink. Or she's blaming the pest. Maybe it's Choo Choo. Who knows? I can't keep smiling around her any longer. I've done all I can to like her. But no matter what. And then we go down to the mausoleum. I can't. And then Soji's like, well, I understand. And so the caterpillar in there, it goes back to the leaf. Like back to the beginning. Like the food that nurtured the egg of the caterpillar that burst from it that became the butterfly. Back to the beginning. And Soji just showing up behind her is so creepy. Your only choice is to revolutionize the world. And a path has been prepared to you to do that. She reminds me kind of like Debbie Gillespie from Addams Family Matters. Like that whole, the sequel to Addams Family. So then, this is hallowed ground, a sacred place where 100 duelists sleep. And this room leads to the end of the world. So by the end of the world choosing them and acknowledging them, is that because they found this room and that's what acknowledged them? Is this supposed to be like a gateway to hell or the afterlife? There's so much that could happen. And so he's like, D13. And then out pops this body. And he's like, look. And he pulls out the ring, this rose seal. It's black. When the bearer dies, it changes color. But I find the black much more beautiful. I'm like, of course you would. You were making love to Mamiya in a morgue, you mother trucker. Of course you would find it beautiful. What? So there's been 100 duelists die in whatever's been going on, which thus begs the question, where'd these rings come from? Who's been delivering? Who's been giving them out like candy? Was it Akio? Was it the prince? There's a lot of stuff going on. A lot of questions that are not getting answered. And she's like, oh, well, this seems rather creepy. And then she starts to back up like, oh, this isn't the interview I thought it was going to be. And he's like, well, you can't run now. And that was the creepiest part where he's like, oh, you can't go anywhere. You've been chosen. And that's when we see the black rose. And Mamiya's like, my black rose chose you. And that look from Mamiya, that little like, that creepy smile, like Anthy is very subdued and doesn't say anything and kind of just smiles, but just like a blank smile, like I'm just going along because I have to. Mamiya has a sinister smile, and I was like, oh no, you're not like Anthy in that you just accept whatever happens because you have to. No, you very much have agency. And whereas Anthy's like, here's all my roses for the duels, y'all play nice. Mamiya don't play nice. No. I was like, oh, bitch. What? And that's when and he takes the black ring in that moment. And they're like, a rose in majestic full bloom at the end of the world. And then, yeah, he's like, is bestowed to you. And then he like basically brainwashes her into becoming a duelist. Insane. So yeah, a rose in full bloom at the end of the world, which is this place. So I guess they're just going to grow these roses. And she basically gets the seal from, it's so creepy, so macabre, so gothic. Like the rose seal getting put on her. So then, Wakaba's like, man, we just had a rager Saturday night. What are we going to do now? She's like, our school's too quiet. And then when Utena goes to the locker, she sees, to the betrothed, I'll wait you in the evening dueling area. And Wakaba's like, I wish something really shocking would happen. I'm like, quit jinxing this, Wakaba. So Utena's like, okay. And that's when we see the Tells. Oh, the Tells did show up. So much happened in this episode. I forgot the Tells showed up here. That's how much has happened in this episode. I forgot that was a thing. So then the Tells show up finally. And they're like, what I feared has come to pass. And they're like, ain't it too early for her? And they're all in like, one's like in a baseball. Like the girl now has a baseball thing. And they're like, my big sister is always ahead of the curve. And they're like, now say ah. And like, what shall we do about this wisdom tooth? What should I do? Get it pulled? So that's interesting. I don't exactly know what to make of that tell thing. They're like, isn't it too early for her? I don't know if the tells are talking about it being too early to bring Kane out. Like, is it too early to be debuting her as a duelist? Like, does that even make sense? And they're like, well, my big sis is always ahead of the curve. So I don't know what that's referring to. And then the wisdom tooth, they're like, should we get the wisdom tooth pulled? The thing about it is, wisdom teeth, you don't pull unless they're like taking up too much space or they're pushing other teeth out. So maybe it was pulling the rows. That tell foreshadowing is very weird. It's very weird. But anyway, so we're back to the song going up. And the fact that at the top of this, there's a row of 100 desks and just outlines of corpses and funeral flowers. Why not? Why not? I would be asking questions if I was Utena. I'd be like, why are there all these deaths on the ground? What is this? And then in very Sailor Moon fashion, we see Kane like with the drip of, I guess, Soji's fashion statement. They're like, this is not Kane's normal self. And she's like, I swear upon this black rose, I'll win this duel and emerge victorious. I'll grant death to the Rose Bride. And Utena's like, what is happening? What's going on? She's like, this is my true self. Again, everything is like all Negaverse black. It's like a mixture of Mamiya and Soji's outfits. Like the other self which slept within. So basically the Black Rose, whereas they talked about the roses in these first duels basically letting the miracle that they wanted to overtake them, here the Black Rose like is supposed to release your inner desires and basically saying that Kane's inner desire is to kill Anthy. Cool. She does look quite wicked there. And then she says, I don't have to play my false self anymore. And Utena's like, this Black Rose is doing it. And she's like, now, draw your sword or the Rose Bride will be mine. So then we have the song that says, whether thou bringst the heirs from heaven, okay, be the intents of hell's heart wicked or charitable. So if we go through this, the heirs from heaven. So we have over here, heirs from heaven. And we have, is hell's intent wicked or charitable? Possibly meaning like, is Soji's work actually bad or is it trying to help? And then, whether thou bringst thee blasts from hell. So we have heirs from heaven, blasts from hell. I'm just going to go through these lyrics one by one here. And say, thou comest in such a questionable shape, I bid thee. Questionable shape, speak to me. And I don't know if the questionable shape is supposed to be, I don't know if the questionable shape is supposed to be like the corpses or as a duelist. I do love the shot of, I will say, for animating Kane, they do make her a bit curvier. They don't make her like a carbon copy body of like Juri or Utena. She has some curves. Girl does. Clearly, Akio is a man of culture. But yeah, I'm so fascinated by, she's like, Kane, that thing you said, swearing on the Black Rose to win the duel. And it says further, upon this night with a horrible moon, thine soul revisits us so. This mystery beyond human knowledge. Yep, that seems beyond it. Makes us human, dwarfed by nature. Like basically saying like the world and the universe is so big it makes us seem so small. So then she destroys the Black Rose. Yep. Tremble in fear at thy image. And the deaths all come together? Oh my god. Nope, into 4 squares and all these bodies surrounding on the ground, 4 being associated with the number of death. Nope. And then her brain basically goes back to normal and the black rose seal collapses and the sword crumbles as well. And Anthy just looks like, okay, cool, glad that we got this over with. Thankfully, she's alive, so good job there. And then the one coffin, like, it just, they put the shoes back in with the coffin, and then he just slips out and just gets fired into the crematorium. And Soji's like, well, another one bites the dust, huh? No wonder the end of the world has such high expectations. A mere facsimile of a duelist created when their heart is frozen. So, just, if you are wondering, a facsimile is an exact copy of a duelist. So, a mere facsimile of a duelist created when their heart is frozen. So, I'm like, did he just kill that guy or was he already dead? But they copied, I'm so fascinated. They're like, a copy's not going to work. He says it has no hope of defeating her. They're like, we can't just get somebody, make him a duelist, and expect that to work. As they, like, smoke a body into the flames of hell. Cool. So then Utena is, like, sitting there, of all things, picking green beans and de-stemming green beans. Why not? Anthy's gonna cook them later. I do find it interesting that there's a newspaper under her doing that, and we started out with Soji looking at a newspaper, which is interesting. So Anthy leaves, and she's like, I'm heading out, and she's like, oh yeah, today's the day you go see your brother, and she's like, see you later. And then she's like, Himamiya, how was Kane-san after what happened? And Anthy's like, oh, she's all better. She's like, well, good. She doesn't remember anything, though, does she? She's like, yep, nothing that led up to the duel. She's like, well, dang it. Now we can't find anything out about her. Also, there's some pink roses on the desk in there. So that's a little note there. But she's like, well, never mind then. I guess she can't tell us what happened. She's like, I'm sorry. She says, I'm sorry that your sister-in-law was hurt. And she's like, well, it wasn't your fault, Utena. Which it wasn't. And she's like, yep, sorry. Say hi to your brother for me. And she's like, I will. Then she says, why don't you go with her, Choo-Choo? But Choo-Choo's like, I ain't going near him. I'm not invited. And then, yeah, the moment she gets back up to the tower, and there he is strung out on the couch with his shirt open. And she puts the glasses on the table, and he says, come to me, Anthy. And she looks very melancholy in that moment. And then it's like darkness descends, and all you see is the planetarium. He's like, did you feel lonely this week? And she says, yes, big brother. And all you see are the stars. And then there's Utena sleeping there. So yeah, I don't even know. I didn't get good vibes initially from Akio, just because, you know, characters like that seem kind of too good to be true. You're like, And then this episode was definitely like, oh no, this is bad. And it's like raining when she goes to visit him. So I'm like, all the symbolism being there of like him forcing Anthy to do things maybe she doesn't want to do. Not getting good vibes, y'all. Not getting good vibes at all. And I've talked for an hour about this episode. Yeah, so Soji and Mamiya are interesting. I'm like, I don't know if they're going to keep trying to get duelists to go and do... I don't know who they're going to recruit next to try to be a duelist. I don't know how that's going to work. Or if that's even going to be a thing. Up until Soji, like, did the crematorium thing and was like, well, we have 100 bodies. We'll just do, like, all these duels against her. Up until that moment... I was like, maybe that's going to be the formula. They're going to try to duel against her with people they've recruited for the Black Rose seminar. But I don't know. The show may go an entirely different route next week. We just don't even know. So, but lots of things to think about. So I'm so excited to see where this goes. I know you all probably can't talk a lot because of spoilers, but whatever your impressions were or whatnot, I hope you all have a wonderful week. Please stay safe, take care, and yeah, I'll be back real soon with more Revolutionary Girl Utena. Bye.